The story behind this impressive aircraft actually began in the Handley Page offices near the end of World War II. Its sleek aerodynamic lines perfectly matched its proud name, the Victor. That is when the British Ministry of Supply put out a requirement to develop a completely new heavy bomber to replace the aging Avro Lincoln. Just weeks after the fighting ended in Europe, company founder Sir Frederick Handley Page reached a definitive conclusion. He made this decision along with his lead engineers, Richard Stafford, Frank Radcliffe, and Godfrey Lee. They realized the heavy bomber of the future had to be an all-jet design with absolutely no compromises. At the time, this was a truly revolutionary concept. To put that in perspective, we can look at the United States and the Soviet Union. Well into the early 1950s, their militaries were still actively upgrading older piston engine bombers right alongside their new jet programs. Initially, the British engineers considered two possible design options. The first was a large four-engine bomber with a maximum takeoff weight, or MTOW, of around 100,000 pounds. The second was a slightly lighter twin-engine design weighing in at roughly 60,000 pounds. The design team decided to push the absolute cutting edge of British aerodynamics. For instance, they decided to use a swept-wing design driven personally by Frederick Handley Page. This happened even before the Allies got their hands on captured German wind tunnel data. The leading edge sweep was planned to be between 40 and 45 degrees. On top of that, they planned to install vertical end plates on the wingtips. They also included small nose-mounted canards to help provide pitch stability for the aircraft. Then, late in 1945, the company finally got a hold of the captured German aerodynamic research. This was a massive breakthrough that significantly accelerated the entire project. By February 1946, the preliminary design of the bomber was complete. In its finalized form, it featured four powerful Rolls-Royce Avon turbojets. The designers seamlessly integrated these engines right into the wing roots. The projected performance numbers were staggering. Maximum takeoff weight topped 90,000 pounds. The range was around 5,000 nautical miles. The aircraft was also expected to hit speeds pushing 600 miles per hour. The wingspan measured an impressive 122 feet. It featured wingtip-mounted vertical stabilizers fitted with rudders, while a swept horizontal tail was mounted on a short vertical stabilizer at the rear. One interesting detail was the nose design on the relatively short fuselage. It featured a flush cockpit profile without a traditional stepped canopy. This was very similar to the front end of the American B-29 Superfortress. In early 1947, the British Air Ministry finally finalized its post-war plans for heavy bomber development. They issued a new set of requirements calling for fully completed long-range jet bomber prototypes by 1952. Faced with these strict new demands, the engineering team had to adapt. After carefully analyzing the captured German aerodynamic data, they had to seriously redesign the layout of their upcoming bomber. The biggest changes were made to the wing, transitioning to a highly unusual crescent shape. This meant the leading edge sweep was steepest right at the wing root, at 48.5 degrees. It then progressively decreased outboard, dropping to 37.5 degrees, and finally down to 26.75 degrees at the tips. It was this innovative crescent wing that kept the aircraft stable and safe at high transonic speeds. It prevented dangerous high-speed flutter and loss of pitch control. Plus, the design turned out to be incredibly practical. Those massive turbojets could be tucked perfectly inside the deep, thick wing roots. Meanwhile, the overall wingspan was reduced to 100 feet. The vertical end plates were permanently removed from the wingtips. The tail assembly featured a massive, swept vertical fin. It was capped off with an all-moving stabilator for maximum maneuverability. Powering the bomber were four turbojets. Each produced 7,500 pounds of thrust. On paper, the new aircraft promised record-breaking performance for its era. Just imagine, it could cover a range of over 3,000 nautical miles at a cruising speed of 575 miles per hour. All this while carrying a massive 10,000-pound nuclear payload. In July 1948, the government officially ordered two experimental HP-80 prototypes. This came after wind tunnel testing backed up all the performance specs promised by the designers. Interestingly, right around the same time, Avro received an order for their own prototype. This would eventually become the legendary Vulcan bomber. Initially, Handley Page engineers planned to equip the bomber with a fully pressurized escape capsule. In an emergency, explosive bolts would separate the entire cabin from the main fuselage. This would save the whole crew. However, Air Ministry officials insisted on a much simpler approach. The military demanded a standard cockpit with traditional ejection seats. These were designed to guarantee a safe bailout at altitudes up to 50,000 feet and speeds pushing 495 miles per hour. By 1950, after running a series of mock-up evaluations, the design team completely scrapped the jettisonable cabin concept. But this created a major issue. They only had room to fit ejection seats for the pilots. The other 3 crew members sitting in rear-facing seats were not so lucky. In a catastrophic emergency, they would have to manually bail out of the crippled aircraft through an escape hatch. This basically made it an every-man-for-himself scenario. To keep the airframe light but incredibly strong, they turned to a technological marvel of the era. They used honeycomb sandwich panels paired with advanced aluminum alloys. The designers were especially proud of the unique crescent wing. To test its real-world aerodynamics, they built the HP-87. This was a 1/3 scale glider replica of the HP-80. On top of that, they built a jet-powered testbed known as the HP-88. This aircraft was essentially a heavily modified Supermarine 510. It served as the prototype for the legendary Swift fighter. It was fitted with the new crescent wing and a T-tail. This featured an all-moving stabilator. Massive speed brakes were mounted on the fuselage sides. Power came from an Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire turbojet. The design left room to swap in more powerful engines down the line. The experimental HP-88 took to the skies for its maiden flight on April 28, 1948. The HP-80 was officially named the Victor in June 1950. By then, the military was so impressed with the design that they immediately ordered an initial batch of 25 production aircraft. The big moment finally arrived in December 1952, when the first full-fledged Victor prototype lifted off the runway. At the controls were the company's chief test pilot and a senior flight test engineer. The public got its first glimpse of the Royal Air Force's formidable new bomber on July 15, 1953. This happened during the coronation flyover. By September of that year, the Victor was the undisputed star of the prestigious Farnborough Air Show. It drew massive crowds and plenty of excitement. However, behind the scenes of these big public debuts, the flight test program was not going nearly as smoothly. Some of the aircraft's handling characteristics turned out worse than expected. This meant the design needed some serious reworking. Then, on July 14, 1954, tragedy struck. During a high-speed, low-level pass, the tail assembly could not handle the immense aerodynamic stress. It tore right off. The first prototype crashed. This disaster was a massive blow to the entire development program. It severely pushed back the schedule. Flight testing was put on hold. The second prototype did not take to the air until September 11, 1954. This happened after engineers carefully analyzed the crash and corrected the design flaws. Official acceptance trials for the Victor kicked off on March 14, 1955. They went incredibly well. Pilots and flight test engineers noted that the aircraft was extremely easy to handle. It was rock solid on its bombing runs. It also completely met all of the Air Ministry's strict requirements. The first production aircraft, designated the Victor B Mark I, took to the skies on February 1, 1956. Compared to the earlier prototypes, this bomber featured a longer fuselage. It was stretched by about 40 inches. The vertical stabilizer was also raised by roughly 14 inches. The vertical stabilizer itself was built using what was then an innovative honeycomb structure. It was significantly reinforced for better structural integrity. Powering the new bomber were 4 Bristol Sapphire 7 Mark II turbojets. Thanks to its outstanding performance, the Victor was a strong contender for the title of the best strategic bomber in its class. It was possibly the most formidable one as well. Under the strict requirements set by the Royal Air Force, the Victor B Mark I had to carry a combat payload of 10,000 pounds. Dropping its payload at the halfway point of a mission from a cruising altitude of around 50,000 feet, the aircraft was expected to have a range of about 5,000 miles. On top of that, its cruise speed was around 575 miles per hour. If the altitude over the target was reduced, the maximum range jumped to nearly 5,600 miles. In a ferry configuration with bomb bay tanks installed, this massive jet could fly an incredible 7,100 miles. Of course, back in those days, public sources only printed unofficial and highly speculative specs for this highly classified aircraft. Sometimes these specifications were downright conflicting. Today, however, we know that the real-world range and service ceiling of the Victor B Mark I turned out to be a bit lower than original estimates. In practice, the combat range was somewhere between 4,350 and 4,660 miles. Its operational altitude topped out between 46,000 and 49,000 feet. Even so, the Victor's numbers were incredibly competitive with the best Soviet and American strategic bombers of the era. These included aircraft like the Myasishchev 3MS and the B-52B. As we know, the early versions of those aircraft had a practical range that did not exceed 5,300 to 5,600 miles. The British bomber actually outperformed them when it came to maximum altitude. It did this all while having nearly half the maximum takeoff weight. British designers achieved these impressive results thanks to highly efficient engines and advanced aerodynamics. They also completely omitted defensive armament. Sure, dropping the tailguns made the aircraft significantly lighter. However, it also left it much more vulnerable. Even today, many military experts argue that defensive suites for heavy bombers have not lost their relevance. And back in the 1950s and early 1960s, air defense networks were dominated by first-generation gun-armed interceptors. During that time, having some built-in protection could have saved more than a few crews in an actual shooting war. By the end of 1956, 10 production aircraft had rolled off the assembly line. They were immediately sent off for rigorous military testing. Here's an interesting detail. Starting with the fourth production bomber, the classic silver fuselage finish was replaced with a special anti-flash white paint. Its primary purpose was to protect the aircraft from the intense thermal radiation of a nuclear blast. On June 1, 1956, a landmark event occurred during a routine test flight. Handley Page test pilot John Allam managed to break the sound barrier in a shallow dive. The cockpit did not even have a dedicated Mach meter, but observers on the ground clearly recorded the distinctive sonic boom. This confirmed the impressive feat. By 1958, the first RAF squadron was fully equipped with these brand-new bombers. Thanks to the aircraft's incredible success, the order for the Victor B Mark I was soon increased to 50 aircraft. However, the last 24 airframes of this run were upgraded to the Victor B Mark I-A standard while still in production. Their standout feature was an advanced electronic countermeasures suite. This complex gear was cleverly tucked away behind the nose radome and in the rear of the bomb bay. It was also hidden under a dielectric fairing in the bomber's tail. Each of these aircraft could be adapted for highly specialized missions. For example, one of the early production Victors was fitted with extensive photo reconnaissance equipment. On another airframe, they actively tested the crucial technique of mid-air refueling. They used a Vickers Valiant as the flying tanker for this. Yet another bomber was involved in an ambitious test program for liquid-fueled rocket boosters called Spectre. These were mounted directly under the wings. Using them pushed the bomber's maximum takeoff weight to an impressive 190,170 pounds. This was achieved while cutting the takeoff roll down to just 1,600 feet. Beyond just developing the standard Victor bomber in November 1951, Handley Page engineers proposed creating a specialized Pathfinder aircraft for target marking. Its primary role would be to lead an entire bomber formation directly to the target area. This variant was designed to have significantly improved flight performance. This was made possible thanks to the new Conway or Olympus engines. They also wanted to arm the aircraft with radar-guided tailguns that could be remotely operated. However, the Air Ministry was not really interested. As a result, the project was canceled. Another interesting derivative of the Victor that never became a reality was a military transport project. It was designed with a longer and much wider fuselage. To make loading bulky cargo as easy as possible, the entire tail section was designed to simply swing open laterally. For power plants, they were considering either Sapphire turbojets or the previously mentioned Conways. At the same time, engineers were working on a civilian airliner variant. In cross-section, its fuselage featured a double bubble layout. You can see a similar design on the American Boeing Stratocruiser airliner. This aircraft was developed from the B-29 strategic bomber. Later, in 1956 and 1958, the company tried a few more times to pitch the military on various transport variants. These designs featured a double-deck cabin, extra fuel tanks, and new engines. The final attempt to turn the Victor into a transport was made in 1961, but it also failed to gain any traction. Britain was not the only country trying to convert combat bombers into transports or passenger airliners. The United States and the Soviet Union were doing the exact same thing. However, most of these efforts were complete failures. There were only a few rare exceptions. These included the Soviet Tu-104 and Tu-114, and the American Boeing C-97 and Stratocruiser. Trying to combine the requirements of a transport and a combat aircraft into a single airframe proved to be a massive engineering challenge. On top of that, by the 1950s, Great Britain was losing its overseas empire. The country simply didn't need a massive fleet of so-called imperial transports to connect different continents anymore. Its aviation needs were now mostly focused on the European theater. The attempt to get commercial airlines interested in a civilian version of the Victor failed to gain traction too. By that time, purpose-built jet and turboprop airliners had already hit the market. They were faster, far more fuel-efficient, and simply a much better fit for routine passenger service. At the same time, there was a rapid advancement of Soviet air defenses. This specifically included the introduction of the S-25 and S-75 surface-to-air missile systems, along with new supersonic fighters like the MiG-19, MiG-21, and Su-9. These new threats forced the British to urgently improve the flight performance of their bombers. The main focus for upgrading the Victor, much like the rest of the British V-bomber fleet, was increasing its maximum service ceiling. It was really the only viable option. After all, you couldn't take an airframe designed for subsonic speeds and magically make it supersonic. Plus, British bombers of that era didn't carry defensive armament. Retrofitting guns without a massive, expensive redesign of the airframe was completely out of the question. From the very beginning, the upgrade program for the bomber was split into two phases. For the first stage, they planned to simply equip the baseline aircraft with new, more powerful Sapphire engines. The second phase was much more ambitious and involved developing a heavily modified version of the bomber. This variant was supposed to feature a fuselage stretched to 137 feet. It would be powered by 4 Conway engines, or potentially even 6 Sapphires. However, those ambitious plans never made it off the drawing board. Work on the simpler re-engined variant was scrapped early on. As for the stretched bomber, building it would have required a massive and incredibly expensive retooling of the factory production lines. Ultimately, the designers settled on a much simpler compromise for the upgrade. This version retained the standard fuselage length and was fitted with 4 Conway engines. It had a maximum takeoff weight of around 170,150 pounds. This specific modernization became the successful foundation for the future development of the legendary Victor bomber. By the late 1950s, a harsh reality became painfully clear to the military. Even if a subsonic bomber was flying at an extreme altitude of over 65,000 feet, modern surface-to-air missiles could still easily shoot it down. To guarantee the survival of their strategic bomber fleet in actual combat, there was really only one reliable option. These massive aircraft had to be armed with long-range standoff weapons. This would allow crews to accurately strike enemy targets without ever entering the lethal engagement zones of air defenses. That is exactly why Great Britain actively began working on air-to-surface guided missiles. This was done alongside developing new variants of its famous V-bombers. Starting in 1957, engineers at Avro worked under strict secrecy to create the Blue Steel Strategic Standoff Missile. This formidable weapon was powered by a large liquid-fueled rocket engine. By 1960, the first version of this missile, designated the Blue Steel Mark I, successfully completed its flight trials. It then officially entered service with the Royal Air Force. Its maximum launch range was around 200 miles. However, British commanders saw the Blue Steel missile as just a stopgap measure. The RAF was waiting for their strategic V-bombers, the Victor and the Vulcan. They were to be equipped with the brand new American air-launched ballistic missile known as the Skybolt. Specifically, this was the GAM-87A variant. This ambitious weapon had been under development in the United States since 1956. The U.S. Air Force planned to use it as a replacement for the Hound Dog missiles. It was intended for their legendary B-52G and B-52H bombers. Meanwhile, the Skybolt was also supposed to become the primary weapon for the upgraded British Victors and Vulcans. Plans called for each of these bombers to carry 2 heavy ballistic missiles on dedicated underwing pylons. The technical specs of this 2-stage, solid-fueled monster were seriously impressive. It was designed to carry a 2-megaton nuclear warhead. It had an estimated maximum range of 1,000 miles. Its launch weight was over 11,200 pounds. Specifically to accommodate the Skybolt, engineers explored an updated variant of the bomber. This would have been designated the Victor B-6. This giant would have featured a significantly enlarged fuselage. This pushed its maximum takeoff weight to a staggering 240,000 pounds. It was expected that this upgraded aircraft could carry 2 to 4 Skybolt missiles. It could also remain on airborne alert for up to 14 hours. At first, it looked like the Skybolt program was making steady progress. In 1962, it even reached the static engine testing phase. But in December of that same year, all work was abruptly canceled. After a lengthy review, the U.S. Department of Defense concluded that the ballistic missile was simply too costly and unreliable. Because of this sudden cancellation, the British Victor B-2 bomber was left without its promised primary weapon. This called the long-term viability of the bomber fleet into serious question. Realizing the strategic landscape had changed, the British Ministry of Defense quickly pivoted. Their top priority shifted to developing a fleet of nuclear submarines armed with Polaris ballistic missiles. British military officials believed at the time that the era of manned strategic bombers was coming to an end. Despite this shift in doctrine, work on improving the Victor itself never stopped. Back in 1956, the manufacturer was awarded a government contract. This was to build 18 Victor B-2 bombers powered by Rolls-Royce Conway turbofans. Over time, requirements expanded, and the total number of aircraft on order gradually increased. It ultimately reached 34 bombers. In January 1959, this upgraded bomber took to the skies for its maiden flight. Unfortunately, tragedy struck in August of that year when the prototype was lost in a crash. The incident significantly delayed the flight test program, but it did not halt it entirely. During further development of the Victor B-2, engineers fitted it with even more powerful Conway 201 engines. Each of these produced an impressive 20,600 pounds of thrust. On top of that, the aircraft received a state-of-the-art photographic reconnaissance suite. This was designed for both high and low altitude missions. This camera array was housed in a dedicated bay right behind the radar radome. With all these modifications, the maximum takeoff weight of the upgraded bomber increased significantly. It reached over 200,000 pounds. One interesting technical feature came out of the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough. Professor Dietrich Kuckemann was a prominent aerodynamicist. Based on his recommendation, engineers installed 2 distinctive pods on the aircraft's wings. They were affectionately known as Cushman carrots. These elongated pods extended well beyond the trailing edge of the wing and served 2 major functions. First, they significantly reduced aerodynamic drag on the massive bomber during transonic flight. Second, the hollow interiors of these carrots proved to be the perfect spot to house ECM equipment. This helped protect the aircraft from enemy radar. Full-scale production of this advanced variant kicked off in November 1961. The final assembled aircraft was delivered to the Royal Air Force in May 1963. The first batch of Victor Mark II bombers went straight to RAF training squadrons. They were powered by Conway 200 turbofans and built without any guided missile capabilities. Frontline units, on the other hand, received a much more capable aircraft. These featured upgraded Conway 201 engines and carried the Blue Steel standoff missile. They also boasted an improved wing design featuring those so-called carrots on the trailing edge. Plus, these bombers were equipped with a significantly more advanced electronic warfare suite. A total of 21 of these aircraft were either newly built or converted from older airframes. Deliveries to frontline units wrapped up entirely in January 1964. A few years later, in 1966, an upgraded Blue Steel missile was integrated into the bomber's arsenal. It could hit targets roughly 270 nautical miles away. This massively expanded the bomber's strike radius. Interestingly, in 1965, 9 of these aircraft were converted into dedicated strategic reconnaissance platforms. To pull this off, engineers packed the massive weapons bay with specialized cameras for both day and night photography. They added extra fuel tanks and even equipped them to drop high-intensity photoflash flares. The Victor bombers served the Royal Air Force faithfully. However, unlike the other aircraft in the legendary V-bomber force, they never actually saw combat in their primary strike role. Since these bombers were designed for unescorted missions deep into enemy territory, crew proficiency was absolutely critical. The selection process for pilots and crew members was incredibly strict. Once a crew was formed, the RAF tried to keep them together for at least 5 years. This ensured the crewmates could anticipate each other's actions without saying a word. On top of that, each bomber had its own dedicated maintenance crew led by a crew chief. The crew chief essentially lived with the aircraft, staying by its side even during major overhauls. They would also fly with the bomber on deployments between bases. Typically, the crew would fly 1 training sortie a day, lasting about 5 hours on average. Every single one of these flights was planned down to the smallest detail. Navigators started studying their practice targets days before takeoff. Hands-on prep at the squadron kicked off 2.5 hours prior. The final pre-flight briefing was held exactly 45 minutes before wheels up. 15 minutes before takeoff, the crew started the engines. One of the most unique tactics in the Victor's combat playbook was a toss bombing maneuver utilizing a half-loop. This was much like its sister ship, the Vulcan. In most other air forces, a maneuver this aggressive was strictly reserved for agile fighter bombers. The massive bomber would streak toward the target at ultra-low level. It would fly at around 1,000 feet at breakneck speed. Once in the target area, the pilot would pull up hard into a half-loop, while simultaneously tossing the nuclear payload. At the top of the loop, the aircraft would roll upright and dive away, escaping the impending blast wave at maximum speed. Looking at the design of this massive bomber, it is built around a conventional aerodynamic layout. It is a mid-wing design. This means the wing passes directly through the center of the fuselage. It has 4 powerful turbojet engines buried completely inside the wing roots. To keep the airframe both light and exceptionally strong, engineers made heavy use of spot welding. They also used specialized castings made from a magnesium zirconium alloy. Its iconic crescent wing deserves a special mention. It features a compound sweep along the leading edge. The sweep decreases from 52 degrees at the root to 35 degrees at the tip. The tail section is a classic T-tail design. It is highlighted by an unusually large elevator area. This gave the heavy bomber excellent maneuverability. The fuselage has a perfectly circular cross-section. It has a diameter of just under 10 feet. The lower nose section houses all the targeting and navigation gear. It visibly bulges downward, giving the aircraft its distinctive chin or beard. The cockpit windows are blended smoothly into the overall contour. They sit completely flush with the airframe to eliminate aerodynamic drag. Structurally, the airframe is divided into 3 main sections. Up front is the fully pressurized cockpit and an avionics bay. This bay relies on ram air for cooling during flight. Meanwhile, the center and tail sections are integrated into a single, incredibly strong shell. This shell is designed to handle intense torsional loads during aggressive maneuvering. The pressurized cabin is sealed by the floor structure below, and a reinforced domed pressure bulkhead at the rear. Inside, the layout is designed for seamless crew coordination. The 2 pilots sit side by side up front. Just behind them, facing aft, the navigator, bombardier, and radio operator work together at a shared console. Right between the pilots sits a large fuel control panel. Interestingly, this panel is mounted on rails. It can actually slide forward to let the bombardier squeeze through to the nose compartment. This is where the optical bomb sight is located. To free up space, the engine throttles and trim controls were eliminated from a center pedestal. They were relocated right onto the cabin sidewalls. The aircraft commander has a separate side panel for the engine starters. Meanwhile, the co-pilot manages a console dedicated to aerial refueling. For safety, the pilots were equipped with Martin Baker ejection seats. In an emergency, they would eject through jettisonable hatches built into the cabin roof. Interestingly enough, the rear crew members were not provided with ejection seats at all. This was the case except in the later tanker variants. If things went wrong, they had to manually bail out through the main entry door on the starboard side. This door hinged upward. On long endurance flights, a sixth seat could be set up right between the pilots. This spot was typically used by a flight engineer. They accompanied the crew on exhausting, long-range missions. A cavernous bomb bay occupied the center of the fuselage. The long, highly reinforced bomb bay doors featured a double-skinned design. This helped them handle intense aerodynamic loads during flight. When opened, these doors retracted upward and completely inside the bay. They did this using two powerful hydraulic jacks. The main landing gear utilized 4 wheel bogies. However, the tires themselves were relatively small, measuring only about 27 inches in diameter. Because of this compact footprint, the gear could easily retract forward. It would stow completely inside the inboard section of the wing. When it comes to power, early versions of the Victor bomber were powered by 4 Bristol Sapphire turbojets. These produced around 11,000 pounds of thrust each. Later, upgraded variants received the much more powerful Rolls-Royce Conway engines. These generated well over 20,000 pounds of thrust per engine. To improve aerodynamics and reduce drag, each pair of wing-mounted engines shared a single common air intake. To help such a heavy aircraft get airborne, it could be fitted with a pair of de Havilland Spectre liquid-fueled rocket boosters under the wings. After takeoff, these RATO boosters were jettisoned and parachuted safely back to the ground, to be recovered and reused by ground crews. The variants serving as aerial tankers carried highly advanced radio navigation gear. This equipment helped the aircraft rendezvous flawlessly for mid-air refueling. Now let's talk about the payload. The bomb bay was incredibly massive, capable of holding a single 22,000-pound bomb or a high-yield thermonuclear weapon. Alternatively, it could carry 2 12,000-pound tallboy bombs, 4 10,000-pounders, 35 1,000-pound bombs, or 39 2,000-pound naval mines. Additionally, using underwing hardpoints, the aircraft could carry up to 14 more 1,000-pound bombs. Of course, these maximum weapon loadouts were mostly theoretical, or required taking off with a very light fuel load. In practice, the standard combat payload was much more modest, typically around 12,000 pounds. Reconnaissance variants of the Victor could carry 108 photoflash bombs in the bomb bay for nighttime missions. Later strike variants, however, were equipped with the Blue Steel standoff missile. It had a maximum launch range of 200 to 310 miles. The missile itself weighed over 16,000 pounds and delivered a devastating nuclear warhead weighing around 2,200 pounds.